Electromagnetic radiation is a natural phenomenon associated with the emission and transmission of energy through electromagnetic waves. For example, the Sun and the Earth are natural sources of electromagnetic radiation, and the Earth's atmosphere protects us from excessive radiation that reaches the Earth from space. Over time, living beings have adapted to natural electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic waves spread into space at the speed of light. Electromagnetic waves are determined by frequency or wavelength. The higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength, and vice versa. Here we see several sources of artificial electromagnetic radiation for which man is responsible. Each of the presented devices works in a certain frequency range. A narrow part of the frequency spectrum belongs to visible light. Interestingly, many telecommunications devices, including children's toys, are assigned the same frequency range as microwave ovens, which heat or cook food. Natural electromagnetic radiation is present in nature and it does not change significantly, but what is changing and what we should be very concerned about is artificial electromagnetic radiation, which is growing exponentially and whose value, as estimated, has reached 10 to the power of 18 times higher levels than natural electromagnetic radiation. When he applied for a patent for a radio, Nikola Tesla called such a system of transmission of electrical energy. So, a wireless system for transmitting information is actually a system for transmitting energy, and it should be considered as such for many reasons. This part of the system sends energy. Energy enters space and reaches a place where it can be received. It is important to take into account that not all of the transmitted energy reaches the place of reception, but part of that energy is dispersed in space. In that space, there are humans and other living beings who also absorb part of the transmitted energy. Since energy represents the potential to do some work, it means that it can trigger certain changes in our body, which disturbs the balance of the whole organism. As a result, the organism weakens and disease occurs. Experimenting with wireless energy transmission in Colorado Springs, Nikola Tesla discovered numerous, until then unknown properties of the atmosphere important for living beings. He discovered that there is an upper layer of the atmosphere which, because it is electrically charged, is called the ionosphere. He discovered that the ionosphere reflects electromagnetic waves. He discovered that there are standing waves in the atmosphere and that the basic resonant frequency of the atmosphere is about 8 Hz. He discovered that the Earth and the ionosphere, together with the part of the atmosphere they bound, form a great resonant circle. Finally, Tesla realized that man acts like an antenna and that our entire biological system, our brain and the Earth work on the same frequencies. Even today's scientists emphasize the electromagnetic nature of the human brain and human consciousness. So, academician Vladimir Par, a physicist, sees the human brain as a fantastically complicated electromagnetic system with billions of short-term alternating currents that emit and absorb electromagnetic disturbances, and recalls Nikola Tesla, who had extremely high sensitivity. We also have a scientific paper from 2014 that says that the human sensory motor system reacts to the environment and is included in its rhythms. Electrical signals in the human body and the tissue functionality that depends on them can be measured. Here we see a voltage curve that represents the electrical signal of the heart, the so-called electrocardiogram, or for short ECG. When an electromagnetic signal appears in the environment, it can affect body signals. Here we see two cycles of the ECG signal. Under normal conditions and at rest, a healthy human heart has about 66 beats per minute and has an appropriate electrical signal waveform. However, the appearance of electromagnetic signals in the environment can cause various disorders and even problems. We find numerous scientific papers about the impact of electromagnetic fields on living beings. The American scientist Alan Frey published a scientific paper in 1969 on the influence of microwaves and radio frequency energy on the frog's central nervous system. It was shown that the generation of a radio frequency pulse synchronized with the R wave of the ECG resulted in tachycardia, arrhythmias, and even cardiac arrest. Brain work takes place with the presence of brain waves, and the frequency of brain waves is related to the state of consciousness. In addition to normal states of consciousness, pathological brain states can also be detected through a diagnostic test called an electroencephalogram. Now you have to ask how signals from the environment affect the work of the brain, i.e., can they disrupt its work? For example, if a strong enough signal appears in the environment that corresponds to the signal measured in a psychomotor disorder, then such a pathological condition can also be expected in a healthy person. Sleep and dreams are also characterized by certain waves. Sleep has its own stages that alternate during sleep, and electromagnetic signals from the environment can affect the rhythm and quality of sleep. Our body needs nutrients and they reach all its parts through the blood. Each individual type of tissue needs specific substances, and when it comes to the brain, the system that controls the permeability of substances from blood vessels, i.e. capillaries, to the brain tissue is called the blood-brain barrier. Drawing number 1 represents a cross-section of the entire brain. Drawing number 2 represents a section of a capillary and the surroundings brain tissue. Drawing number 3 represents the space that separates the capillary blood from the brain tissue and is called the blood-brain barrier. Some scientists studied how the presence of an electromagnetic field affects the functionality of the blood-brain barrier. Alan Frey and colleagues conducted an experiment on rats by irradiating their brains with radio frequency fields. The experiment showed that the permeability of the blood-brain barrier in the brains of mammals changes when they are exposed to radio frequency electromagnetic fields. The same scientist discovered in 1962 that electromagnetic fields can cause certain auditory effects in humans. He discovered that electromagnetic fields in both healthy and deaf people can cause the sensation of hearing by stimulating either a nerve or bone tissue near the ear. Experiments conducted by scientist James Lean in 2022 confirmed this observation and expanded knowledge. According to some studies, a series of microwave pulses can be felt by people as a buzzing, chirping, or melody, and with an increased intensity of the stimulus, tissue injury can occur. Exposure to electromagnetic fields can also cause changes in blood cells. Here we see the consequences of exposure for three situations, depending on the type and intensity of the electromagnetic field, as well as the duration of the exposure. Exposure to electromagnetic fields has been growing exponentially since the mid-70s of the last century, and statistics speak of a proportional increase in health issues that are included in autism spectrum disorders. On this graph, it is important to notice, with an increase in the frequency of electromagnetic waves, we have an increase in energy absorption for water and oxygen, two types of substances essential for life. If we start from the fact that the human body consists of up to 70% water and that the absorption of energy can change the properties of substances, the risk of health problem increases. There is a particularly significant degree of energy absorption at certain frequencies, and with the introduction of 5G technology, we enter precisely those frequency areas. An exposure to electromagnetic fields can be described by the power density of the electromagnetic field. It is the ratio of power to the area perpendicular to the direction of propagation of electromagnetic waves and is expressed in watts per square meter. For practical reasons, values can be expressed in microwatts per square meter or in microwatts per square centimeter. Guidelines on what values are considered acceptable for living beings are provided by the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, abbreviated ICNIRP. Governments of almost all countries of the world follow its recommendations. However, we also have independent scientists whose opinion does not coincide with ICNIRP's. While ICNIRP recommends that the upper acceptable limit of exposure to electromagnetic radiation is 10 millionths watts per square meter, according to the opinion of independent scientists, it is 1000 microwatts per square meter or 10,000 times less. And what this is about? Numerous scientists question ICNIRP's credibility, both in terms of determining the limits of the permissible strengths of electromagnetic fields and in terms of connection with corporations whose interests are higher allowable limits. For example, in the presentation of Dr. Magda Havas, we find a number of remarks made by the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields on the ICNIRP guidelines. Among others, the Commission points out that, in addition to thermal effects, biological effects should also be considered. The short-term experiments cannot predict long-term effects. That studies regarding cancer induction are biased. That absorption is not the same at all ages. That not everyone is equally sensitive to electromagnetic radiation. That modulation, polarization, and signal frequency should not be ignored. That synergistic effects with other environmental factors should be taken into account, that there is an impact on the environment, that the models are bad in terms of an impact on DNA damage. The declaration of the 5G networks as safe without prior testing is also criticized. As a result, there is an urgent need to establish safe guidelines regarding exposure to radio frequency electromagnetic fields. On the left is an illustration that refers to a document from the US Naval Medical Research Institute and draws attention to the numerous health problems associated with electromagnetic radiation, which have to do with the nervous system, eyes, heart, respiratory organs, skin, and other parts of the body. On the right is the title page of that document. The bibliography includes more than 2,000 works with previously recognized biological phenomena and clinical manifestations attributed to radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation. The document was declassified back in 1972, and it is all the more important because today the official risk assessment of exposure to radiofrequency electromagnetic fields is based on ICNIRP guidelines that do not include biological effects. And Martin Pal, Professor Emeritus of Biochemistry and Basic Medical Sciences at Washington State University, questions the validity of the ICNIRP guidelines. He points out that the ICNIRP guidelines do not predict biological effects and therefore do not predict safety either. Tom Butler is a award-winning researcher and scientist with the title of Professor of Information Systems and a recognized expert in semantic and regulatory technologies. He draws attention to the fact that harmful effects occur well below the limits set by ICNIRP, in the form of very serious health problems such as cancer, genotoxicity, or neurodegenerative diseases. In 1975, something unusual and worrying happened. It was about the fact that the employees of the American Embassy in Moscow developed serious health problems which were later linked to artificial electromagnetic radiation coming from the neighboring building. Why is it particularly interesting in the context of security? Because the radiation levels declared safe by ICNIRP far exceed the levels that in this event have been shown to cause serious health problems and both exceed the levels considered safe by independent scientists. Therefore, when everything is summarized and respecting the precautionary principle, there is enough reason to recognize the guidelines given by independent scientists as a reference. The values in the table represent power density, i.e. power per unit area, and anything over 1000 microwatts per square meter can be considered extremely worrying. Thank you for your attention.